Today's story is presented by Time Safari's walking tours in Rockhampton. If you are visiting central Queensland, why not take a tour and discover the murders, ghosts, crimes, and if the real Jack the Ripper once stalked the city. In 1944, a chain of American fashion stores called Jackson's announced to their customers they had just received a shipment of fur coats for sale. This was remarkable for two reasons. One, 1944 meant the store was announcing the sale of these fur coats while the Second World War was raging across the globe. While nations like England were under strict rationing and most European and many Asian nations were being torn apart by war, this chain of stores decided now was the time to sell some fur coats. The second remarkable fact was, Jackson's proudly announced it had also restocked the much sought after Queensland beaver fur coat. Now, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you might be aware of how Rockhampton once was the centre of a brutal fur industry, with 1 million koala pelts collected for the US fashion market in 1927. Moves to shut down this industry by an Australian who would one day become the President of the United States had local furriers simply switching the name of koala pelts to wombat or some other species. But inspections quickly revealed the furs belonged to koalas. And you can see this full story here. So, was the Rockhampton fur industry up to their old tricks? It was a fair question. Were Australian pelts once more being deceitfully sold as fur from other animals? Well, it turns out yes and no. The US fur industry has always had animals it favours for quality of pelt. Softness, hardness, colour, and insulation capabilities are just some of the few attributes the fur industry looked for in a pelt. This explains why the hardy koala fur was so sought after. Thousands of mink, beaver, seal, and let's not forget the big cat furs like leopard and tigers were sold every year, requiring the death of hundreds of thousands of already endangered animals to meet the industry's needs. One mink coat required 60 animal pelts, while it takes up to 300 chinchilla for one of those jackets. Well, it turns out, for most of the 20th century, as high as 1 in 20 fur coats sold in the US was a fake. Certainly, they were real fur, but simply put, if the fur industry had killed and skinned all the animals it said it did for those thousands of coats every year, well, there would have been a cataclysmic extinction event not seen since the dinosaurs ran headlong into an asteroid. No, it turns out Queensland and other Australian state furriers had been pulling the wool over America's eyes for decades. And when I say wool, I mean
What's up, Doc?
my nose began twitching when I saw US newspaper ads for Queensland beaver coats. For those who are not aware, there are no beavers in Australia. Those kooky little rodents once dominated the Northern Hemisphere, but recently they have been restricted mostly to North America and a few European locations. This required investigation, and I quickly discovered Queensland was also once known for a supply of black, white, brown, and red fox, sable, squirrel, chinchilla, leopard, lion, teal, tiger, and also Arctic, Australian, and bay seal furs. Now, Australia was once a great supplier of seal fur, but the rest of those, just like the beaver, they are all Northern Hemisphere or African species. They are not from Australia. Something is going on. Well, it turns out all of those Australian furs that American women were so proudly sporting were made from rabbit fur. In the 1940s, rabbit fur was not only considerably cheaper than pelts from all these other animals, they were from a far more sustainable and important source. Rabbits had been introduced into Australia with the first fleet, but every Australian knows that it was in Victoria where a population of 24 rabbits were released in 1859 to be hunted for sport. Myth busted. Australians believe the future rabbit apocalypse that would do severe damage to the continent was due to these first introductions. But this is simply not true. It turns out, marsupial predators like the tiger cat or native quoll were more than happy to hunt down and eat these rabbits. with numerous accounts recording quolls eating every rabbit released in these early colonies. This unfortunately led to a quoll massacre as farmers wiped out the little carnivores, almost sending them into extinction. With quolls systematically exterminated, very quickly rabbits, they bred like rabbits. Soon, the continent was suffering from a serious plague of near biblical proportions. These rabbits began stripping a dry and already barren landscape of what little nourishment was left for the native and for these colonies, important farm animals, and causing serious problems. This rabbit plague soon became so bad that remote regions at the time like Rockhampton, that so far had no rabbits, had something of a countdown in their local newspapers. The region could see the rabbits coming, mile by mile, every year, and it was just a matter of time until the rodents were destroying the local countryside and farmland of central Queensland. By the 1920s, rabbits could be found all across Australia, with an estimated population of 10 billion animals. Something had to be done. Mass hunting entered the numbers and even led to the creation of one of the nation's most famous sports teams, the Rabbitohs, named after the men who hunted and sold rabbit skin and meat. Funnily, that name today has many overseas sports commentators always scratching their heads. However, under plague conditions, hunting could do little to stem the tide. And worse, with most Australian men fighting the Second World War, fewer rabbits were being killed this way, and numbers were once again rising. Almost all Australians know it was the introduction of a virus called myxomatosis in the 1950s that wiped out the rabbit population by around 95%. But before this happened, this plague led to the question, with so many rabbits, surely there was some use for them. Since prehistoric times, humanity has known rabbit fur was both soft and dense, and could not only be used to make everything from baby blankets to hats, it turns out the fur could also be cut, styled, and coloured to resemble most other desired pelts. Australian furriers got to work and soon developed processes that allowed rabbit fur to mimic almost any other pelt a customer could want. Thanks to all this, it is estimated by the mid-1920s at least half of the furs sold in America were made from rabbit. Australia had just managed to pull off one of the greatest cons of the 20th century, a con that went for nearly 5 decades. In 1927, one of America's leading rabbit experts, Marcellus W. Meek, wrote about the sudden rise of the rabbit fur industry. Where one sealskin coat graced Milady of Fifth Avenue in 1900, 100,000 fur coats of rabbit seal are turned out on 6th Avenue during the fur season for the misses of Main Street all over America. That same year, an article spread throughout Queensland newspapers in much the same way rabbits were spreading throughout Australia. This was a report of the financial and social benefits of the growing Australian rabbit industry. It said over the previous year, Australia exported rabbit and hare skins to the value of £2,837,663. America was the principal importer, and in 1925 took £1,834,850 worth. It may be remembered that some months ago, Mr. Walter Pike of Stanthorpe raised the question not of increasing the rabbits in Queensland, but of increasing their commercial value by crossing with breeds from France and Belgium, which are famous for fur flesh. It was Rockhampton that apparently was leading the way, with one farmer looking to import rabbits with known superior fur. Truth be told, this was not the first time this happened either. To show just how clueless early settlers were to the damage of the landscape they were causing around them, in 1871, a Rockhampton newspaper recorded how Captain Bundle placed a few pink-eyed rabbits on Hummocky Island outside Keppel Bay and took a lease of the island so as to preserve the animals from molestation. The island is now a perfect warren, swarming with rabbits, and Captain Bundle has just landed there a few of the common grey species. We do not wish to see the rabbit introduced on the mainland, as it would soon become a pest to farmers and gardeners, but can do no harm on the small islands along the coast, which might, with advantage, be turned into shooting grounds for our amateur sportsmen, or possibly the rabbit might afford timely relief to shipwrecked mariners. Absolute morons. Today we know rabbits can absolutely strip a small island of all its plant life. and these rabbits were apparently still alive in the 1950s, and due to the lack of food, had turned arboreal. In other words, these were rabbits that were now climbing trees for food. I will admit I can find no mention of there being any rabbits on the island today. Now, that doesn't mean they're not there, that just means I cannot find any mention of somebody talking about them. And going back to that 1927 newspaper article, it mentioned that it wasn't just rabbit fur either that was needed. Overseas markets, such as London, were desperate for meat, and Australian exports of frozen rabbits and hares from 1925 to 1926 were to the value of £399,039. This market was only possible thanks to the invention of quality refrigerated chips, and an early attempt at this market led to a disaster in 1898. The Sydney Morning Herald that year reported, many of the rabbits by the steamer Banffshire, which left Rockhampton on August 24th and Sydney on August 31st, were in rotten condition when the vessel arrived in London. Now, the Banffshire was a refrigerated ship built in 1894, and it was lost in 1917 when it was torpedoed by a German U-boat. Still, frozen Australian rabbit meat was soon flowing into war-ravaged Europe and helped save many refugees, soldiers, and local citizens from starvation. At this point, for nearly 2 decades, Australia was passing off rabbit fur as pelts from other animals. Yet this practice soon caught up with the industry. At a New York meeting in 1928, the US fur industry started grumbling about how Australian rabbit pelts had been flooding the market and was deceitfully being branded as more expensive furs like beaver. This issue came up again and again for the next decade. However, it wasn't until 1938 that the US Federal Trade Commission ruled that this renaming practice was just deceptive enough to be illegal. They announced the name of the animal had to be marked on the label along with the name of the fur imitated. This explains why during the war, seal-dyed coney, beaver-dyed coney, and mink-dyed coney started dominating the US clothing store ads. This did not seem to dent sales, however, because nobody knew what a coney was. US sales were so strong that it was becoming actually hard to get furs in Australia for its own industry, though this was also likely due to the shortages during the war. In 1941, the Brisbane Telegraph reported the difficulty Australian furriers were having getting pelts from overseas. Don't worry, because they were now concentrating on using wallaby and water rat fur. And in Rockhampton, which is one of the great meat-producing regions of the world, local companies were gearing up to start using other animal skins like dyed lamb, which they boasted resembled chinchilla. Well, if so much money was being made, what happened to the Rockhampton fur industry, I hear you ask? Well, in truth, several factors. Other nations like China were now producing their own furs, plus the stigma of wearing animal skin was growing in the West, so the numbers of furs actually needed dropped drastically. Also in Australia, numbers were collapsing as the nation's scientists tried to control the rabbit plague by introducing myxomatosis. The rabbit meat industry was also collapsing. At its height in the 1940s, as most beef, pork and lamb products were needed for the war effort, Australians were eating well over 27 million rabbits a year. But these numbers plummeted as chicken slowly took over as the preferred cheap, lean meat. And so the industry evaporated. Yet, for nearly 5 decades, Australia had sneakily taken American fur wearers to the cleaners. And the odd thing is, this industry may well be on the rise again. Recently, rabbit numbers in Australia have begun to rise. Though the various viruses released over the years have decimated their population, these have never completely eradicated them. And with millions of animals, it only takes a few individuals to have some sort of immunity, and their numbers will soon rise again. Virus-tolerant rabbits are again swarming across some parts of Australia. So, perhaps coming to a US store will be some traditional product which will soon be based on rabbit, and Australia will be more than happy to supply them. Thanks for taking this Time Safari's trip to the past, and for more Australian or Central Queensland stories, subscribe to our page or join one of the Time Safari's historic walking tours of Rockhampton. And please check out our books. I hope to talk to you soon.